He was in the wrong place at the wrong time, so he was turned into a horrible monster. He was forced by the Shredder to commit crimes in order to return to his normal self. But what if his previous form was just a disguise for a horrible monster? Join me today as I explore and try to make some sense of the original Mutagen Man. Mutagen Man was one of the earliest toy designs created by Peter Laird, way before mutated villains were considered for the line. The original concept was titled The Unknown and was present in Kevin and Peter's meeting at Playmates around late 1986 and early 1987. The Unknown was a horror sci-fi character that was going to be the product of a partly successful attempt at combining two species into one mutant. Unfortunately, the partly unsuccessful side of it was that he needed to keep all his organs inside a container. The concept implied that the toy would have some sort of liquid inside that would allow its organs to float and would come with an internal lighting feature. The figure was likely submitted to Playmates in 1989 when it was redesigned by freelance designer Russ Edmison. While Playmates still referred to it as The Unknown, they were already playing with the name Incredible Mutating Man. Peter redesigned Russ's version, bringing it closer to the character as we know it. But even at this point, he was still a composite of two animals. Playmates probably changed this with the idea that it would have a better chance of getting adapted into the cartoon without the double species feature. The design then went to Anaglyph Studios, where the exterior was sculpted by Scott Hensey and the guts by David Arshosky. This will come out later in this video again, but the similarities with the Toxic Avenger were likely intentional, although not as deliberate as with Muckman. Around the time this figure was released, Playmates was also working on the action figures for the Toxic Crusaders, and it's my understanding that Anaglyph Studios was also heavily involved with it. Mutagen Man was released in 1990, the same year as Muckman, another character that relied on gross-out humor. According to the character's bio, Seymour Guts was one of Krang's experiments gone wrong. As a result, he had to replenish himself with retro mutagen to stay alive. This dependency on that hard-to-get substance forced him to work for the Shredder. It's unclear if he was supposed to have the ability to shapeshift, but the card said that he was an ever-changing mutant monster. The figure came equipped with a mutagen machine gun and a see-through life support system that could be filled with liquids that would make his gooey garbage float. The packaging suggested using water or ooze, but most kids probably only used water, as ooze would have been harder to clean. The action figure was reissued over the years. A few years ago, it was released with only a hose, a move that left many collectors scratching their heads, as it was missing the tank the hose was supposed to be connected to. This was recently fixed in the latest reissue of the figure. For the adaptation, Mutagen Man was introduced in the cartoon by David Wise in 1991, where he was played by Rob Paulson. In his first and only appearance, Seymour Guts was a fly-by-night messenger who was trying to deliver a message to a flower shop. This led him to the first floor of the abandoned warehouse where Shredder was working on his latest scheme. This coincided with a rocket launch that was about to take place in New York, of all places, to transport a shuttle that was going on a 4-year mission to explore the surface of the planet Venus. Their plan was to mix mutagen with the rocket's fuel, so that the vapor trail would mutate the population of New York. Now, you may ask yourself, why? In any case, they were running out of time and had no luck stealing a missing component for their solution, Bindex 3. This chemical substance would make the mutations permanent. Unfortunately, Bebop and Rocksteady failed at stealing it after they called too much attention to themselves. So back to Seymour. He stopped to ask Shredder if this was the flower shop. After insisting several times that he had to deliver the message there, Bebop and Rocksteady shot at the platform he was standing on, making him fall into the unstable mutagen, where he was broken apart. Using a life support system, the bad guys managed to put him back together, but he was now dependent on the mutation-causing agent coming out of the tank on his back. Because of this, Rocksteady nicknamed him Mutagen Man. Seymour was devastated. In his current shape, he would have preferred to look like Bebop. After saying this, he shapeshifted, taking his form and voice. For Krang, this was an eventful discovery. Since his mutation wasn't permanent enough, he could hold a shape for a few minutes, enough to infiltrate the lab and steal the Bindex 3 they needed. Seymour could benefit from getting the chemical because this would allow him to shapeshift into his old self permanently. However, Seymour quickly realized that he could shape into any form but his former self. Make a mental note of that. Seymour initially resisted the idea of stealing, but he had no choice, as he needed the Bindex 3 to return to normal. Taking advantage of Irma, who was there with April reporting on Bebop and Rocksteady's robbery attempt from earlier, he stole the Bindex 3. Unfortunately, his mutation was running out of time, and he had no choice but to run away, and the Bindex 3 ended up loaded into the Channel 6 news van. Seymour then had to infiltrate the Channel 6 building, passing off as Vernon to recover the Bindex 3.
Excuse me? My, what a handsome fellow.
To April, this was a very erratic behavior coming from Vernon, so she followed him until she saw Seymour turn back into the Mutagen Man. After getting caught, Seymour captured April, tied her to a cable car line, and left her to a slow and painful death. It turns out that crime is a slippery slope after all. You start out stealing a chemical to survive, and before you know it, you're sending reporters to their doom like a Bond villain. Fortunately, April was able to operate the turtle comm in her pocket and alerted the turtles, who came to her rescue. Seymour would quickly learn that his swift journey into crime wouldn't pay. After delivering the Bindex 3, Shredder disconnected him and rushed to the launch site. This looked like the end of the line for Seymour. But the turtles now knew about Seymour's plans thanks to April, and they arrived in time to reconnect him. After learning about Krang's plan to mutate the population of New York, they used Mutagen Man against them by confusing the villains and saving the day. With the Bindex 3 now in their hands, Seymour was only one mutation away from returning to normal. The reason he couldn't turn back to his former self before was because he couldn't remember what he looked like. Donnie found a photo ID in his wallet and offered to show it to him so he could be normal again. But Seymour didn't even let him show him the picture. He simply changed into a better-looking man. That night, the turtles were watching April on TV and were surprised to see her announce she was going on a date with the now better-looking Seymour, the man who had tried to kill her earlier that day. Now, you may be wondering why April would announce she was going on a date on live TV. In any case, despite the action figure's popularity, Mutagen Man was notoriously absent from other media until he was adapted into the 2012 cartoon and the IDW comics, much later. The Fred Wolf version didn't appear in any video games until Mutant Madness in 2020. A year later, he received the action figure treatment from both NECA and Super 7, recreating the Fred Wolf and Playmates looks respectively. In fact, Super 7 would go the extra mile by also releasing a spectacular glow-in-the-dark version as well. Now, what does Mutagen Man remind you of? There seem to be a few inspirations blended into the character. The Toxic Avenger comes to mind, but Toxie inspired another character named Muckman, who I'll talk about soon. To me, there's a notable similarity with a Batman villain named Preston Payne, the third Clayface. Both were body horror icons who needed containment suits and turned to crime, not for power, but to ease their own pain. This similarity is perhaps more evident in the earlier designs. Having said that, gross-out humor was very popular at the time, with properties like Madballs and Garbage Pail Kids, and I'm pretty sure those were a more significant influence on Mutagen Man, especially given his Seymour Guts name. Seymour Guts? Get it? In any case, I started this video suggesting that Seymour was already a monster before his mutation. To be completely honest, how David Wise finished the episode seemed to imply that Seymour had too much bad luck, and this tragedy turned things out for the best. That seems to be the official take on the character. But watching this episode again, I can't help but think that David accidentally wrote him as a psycho killer. Think about it. He justified his presence throughout the episode by saying he needed to deliver a message. But he somehow ended up on the first floor of an abandoned warehouse that looked nothing like the flower shop he had to visit. He was completely unfazed by Bebop and Rocksteady's looks, making me feel like he was stalking them, and perhaps even wanted to join them. He was initially surprised that the Shredder wanted him to steal, but he quickly changed his mind when he realized he could look like somebody else. It wouldn't make sense for him to not be able to turn back into his former self. If there's a face you should remember, it's your own. But if you were a psychopath with a delusional self-image and aversion to being vulnerable, then you probably wouldn't want to look like you really do. In fact, later on, when Donnie suggested using his photo ID, Seymour quickly turned into someone else. Someone who may or may not exist. Perhaps how Seymour saw himself. Behind the happy accidents of his mission to get the Bindex 3 was another horrific revelation. He could have trapped April somewhere after she discovered him, just like he did with Irma. Instead, he tied her to a cable car line and let her be transported to what would have been a horrible and slow death had it not been that the turtles were nearby. To make things even more disturbing, just a few hours later, and after he changed his looks, he asked April out on a date, and she fell for his charm. It's a good thing that this episode had no consequences, because that is an ending that was one music choice away from a horror movie ending.
Ready, Seymour? Ready, April.
In any case, these are just some of my random thoughts. In reality, the episode was very funny and surreal, and not meant to be taken that seriously. What do you think of this character? Do you think there was something twisted with him? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching. See you in the sewers.